I'll now like to introduce today's presenters. Michael Jansen, Chief Research Officer, guides and practices research agenda and architecture by leveraging his extensive experience to identify and unlock emerging trends. Amy Fong, partner, leads Everest Group's sourcing and vendor management practice. In this role, she advises enterprises on maximizing value from strategic provider relationships in global services categories. David Rickard, Vice President, leads Everest Group sourcing and vendor management and customer experience management services offerings for EMEA clients as well as select global accounts. And with that, I'd like to turn things over to Michael.
Hello, everybody. Uh, Entering 2022 here, we're going to follow on to our 2022 key issues webinar that we did, where we examined the issues and concerns of the overall enterprise. And today we're going to delve down into the procurement specific topics and what we think we can do to help the organization. And Amy and David are experts in this. And so what they're going to do is we're going to do a little bit of context for the problem and specifically to procurement and sourcing. And then we're going to drill down into our 5 success driving actions we think are most important as we go into the year. So I did want to kind of set context here. We know the talent shortage is very real. We're seeing that in all dimensions with both rates increasing and staffing taking a considerable amount of time. We see, and you'll well, let me talk to the slide here, but we also see that inflation is roaring, and we see that supply chain issues are well at hand. So if you think about where we were at kind of at a macro perspective going into the year, the adopting our new business models has been our traditional #1 issue for the business. And what we looked at there has been saying, hey, listen, we've got to change to e-commerce. We need to look at new digital operating models. That has been the #1 concern. But as talent has bubbled up to the very top in 2022, it is now become the priority that everybody's concerned about at the C-suite. In addition to that, we've got price and cost pressures, as I was indicating, inflation, and inflation something that we haven't seen to the extent that it is right now, probably in anybody here on this call, of course, since it's probably the highest in 40 years for most geographies. So anyway, something that take in consideration from a macro perspective, but we want to bring that down into the specifics for procurement. So what we're going to do is we're going to lay out the 5 challenges here. And on these 5 challenges, we're going to start with the #1 challenge here being lack of available talent. So as we roll into the next section here, we want to talk about this within the sourcing function, and we want to talk about it in the wider business context. So if we can go to the next slide here, I'm going to turn it over to Amy to talk about challenge #1.
Yeah, so the lack of available talent we see in the market right now is a real challenge. The couple of changes we saw in that slide for just the talent shortage in general, and then there's a lot of drivers behind that, but there's also drivers that are changing the way businesses work. Our business model, for instance, in IT becoming more about IT for growth instead of IT for infrastructure and data and really a much more front-facing, customer-facing stance on a lot of functions that are driving this. So when we ask people why they're seeing a talent shortage, this almost feels like old news in February. Even though we did this study within the last 60 days, the Great Resignation has become kind of ubiquitous at this point. We can't find enough people to fill qualified roles, and we can't keep the people we have. Right. And then all of these other kind of side effects of that, like not being able to keep up with rising salaries and offers not being accepted. And, this feels like a lot of symptoms of an overall challenge around attracting and retaining enough people. And this is hitting both procurement and it's hitting all of the functions across the business. So when we look at services categories specifically, whether you're buying outsourced services or whether you're staffing a team overseas, any kind of global services challenges, this is really hitting the bottom line, and sourcing teams need to deal with that. When we look at, kind of the headcount growth that we're expecting, we asked across 4 big groups in the business, and the sourcing area or the broader procurement function is anticipating about a 4.5% growth in 2022. That's pretty significant. We anticipated that in 2020. Of course, the 2020 key issue study was done before COVID hit, right? And then we saw going into 2021, there was a scaling back of those goals, and then in 2022, bam, up, back to a growth mindset. Interestingly, if you look at IT and engineering, they're even higher than that. IT function and engineering functions really anticipate, a harsh scaling which means if you're in a sourcing role where you're responsible for helping to contract with the talent organizers or the talent providers, service providers, MSPs, whatever, that support those functions, you're probably in for a busy year.
Yeah, and Amy, I think it's not just the anticipated headcount growth here. It's also the anticipation and the increase in the salaries that are being
exactly
put forth here. So I think that's going to probably be the double whammy. As people want to grow, but the cost is going to bust a lot of budgets this year.
Yeah, that's a great point. I mean, Michael, you've always made that point. We don't, it's hard for people to say their budgets are going up, but if they talk about their people going up, it's almost guaranteed their budget is going up as well. And so this is a bit of a proxy for that.
And I think Amy, just on that point as well, I think one of the things that we're hearing from the market that we're talking to is that obviously you need to be really focusing on talent acquisition. So really going out there and identifying how you can find the right talent and how you can get it. And I think that I won't read each of the bullet points on this slide because Michael would kill me, but one of the things that we're hearing is that obviously thinking of things such as location choices, so where people can work from. So how do you broaden your talent search area? So letting people work remotely maybe, or looking at new markets for that. We also see things such as different channels of hiring, so things such as gig workers. These are things that organizations are having to think about in terms of being able to go and acquire that talent that they need. And then obviously the other point that often can get overlooked is thinking about how you retain your talent that you've got. So it's about treating people right when they're there, but it's also thinking about, do you have to do new things for them? Is it around we're seeing sometimes there are counter offer strategies. There may be out of turn increases in terms of bonuses, but it's really putting a whole plan in place, not only just to go and get new talent, because it's hard to find. Also, how do you keep the people you've got? Because they already know your business. They already understand the organization and what you need. So actually putting a lot of effort into that is actually a smart move as well.
Yeah, and we go a lot deeper, and we're going to just do a cursory look at the talent issue in this section here, but we go a lot deeper. So if you want to understand how we're thinking about not only the supply side, but also the demand side and in the retention conversation, please reach out to us. We'd be happy to drill down on that. We've got hundreds of slides on that, but I wouldn't let David put them all up on the screen today. So. So let's do this. Let's talk about this. One of the other macro issues is the tendency for organizations to think about, moving more centralization, moving more decentralization, moving insourcing versus outsourcing. And I'm just going to pick on this real quick. But if one of the trends we're seeing here is if you can't find the talent within, or can't build a strategy that allows you to hire it, one of the things we're seeing is an increase or pickup in the movement to outsourcing. And so that's the stated intention that says they want to go look for resources in an outsourcing model. And so I think that's going to be important. And in fact, we want to ask you, what are you thinking about that in terms of 2022? And so we got a quick poll that we're going to open up here. And we're going to give you the chance of thinking about what you're thinking, what you're considering for your outsourcing services spend. So this is a spend question. Are you tending to increase or decrease your outsourcing of services? So this would be like the people in IT, HR, finance, procurement, and some of the other industry specific. Okay, so the responses are coming in here. Amy, you're seeing the answers there. I'm sure it's looks like it's heavily weighted toward the increasing side. So we'll close it here in 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. And what I'm seeing here, Amy, is really almost across the board, well, probably 70% of the answers are on the increase side. And it looks like about an average of about 15 to 20% increase if you did a weighted average there, something like that.
Yeah.
Is that what you're hearing from clients as well?
Yeah, it is. It is. We're seeing people look everywhere, just like you showed in that last slide. We're seeing clients saying, look, maybe I need to look at a captive, maybe I need to look at a third party, onshore, offshore, other locations. So spend in general increasing in terms of going to external spend. Interestingly, usually when you're making that decision of, do we go onshore, offshore, do we go to a shared services or in-house center, captive, global business centers, whatever you call it, procurement's often involved in that decision. It's kind of a make versus buy decision, so we're well equipped. But we are definitely seeing that in the end, there's a shift towards spending more. Again, it's a proxy for the salaries of those, or the rates, the labor rates going up, as well as a proxy for increasing shift in the amount of work.
All right, so if we know there's a talent shortage, it's not going away. We know that people, and according to what we've heard before and what we saw in this quick poll here, people are looking at more outsourcing. So is that the silver bullet? And David, I wanted to get your sense here in terms of how are service providers coming across with price increases. Is that a rumor?
Yeah, thanks, Michael. No, it's not a rumor. I mean, I think what we're definitely seeing in the market is that there is pretty substantial wage inflation. So you can see on the slide, we talk about from the in-house or captive centers, 6 to 10% average wage inflation over the last few months. If you're looking at it from a service provider perspective, they're talking about 8 to 15%. And actually, it's even higher if it's a real in-demand role. So some of the more technical roles, because we've covered quite a lot in the past around the shortage of real technical roles. So we're definitely seeing these wage increases or wage inflation coming, and then service providers are looking to pass that cost on to their clients. And on the next slide, we just go into a little bit more detail actually about, should you be expecting, if you're in procurement and you're hearing a 10, 15% wage increase, should you be expecting that to be hitting you in terms of a request from your providers in terms of increasing their price? And definitely you shouldn't. And we've talked about this a bit in past webinars, but you can see the breakdown there in terms of the cost components of a BPO service. And so wages are a large portion of that, as we all know, so up to 60%. But what we've worked out is in terms of if you're seeing that 15% wage increase, really you can expect an impacted sort of a price increase of being asked for around 7 to 9%, but it's not a linear 1-to-1. So I think it's just being in procurement, you should be careful about what your service providers are saying and listen to it. And I think everyone wants to be fair to their service providers and treat them so in the right way, so you get the right talent, but really understanding where you are from a price benchmarking perspective, understand what your baseline is, and then understanding how that price is made up. So you can really understand if the increases that are being asked for are fair.
Yeah, and David, the example you just provided there is really kind of for a heavily services, heavily labor-based type scenario. There are technology-based or more infrastructure bases that we're actually still seeing rates go down. So it's important that you kind of understand the dynamics that are in play here. Heavily labor-based, yeah, you're going to expect some increases, but some of the technology transactional type material is still actually seeing decreases. So we can help you with that if that makes sense.
Yeah, no, totally, Michael. And I think as we see more sort of automation coming in, that can help to offset some of that. So it is the role, but we're talking about BPO services here specifically, which are the heavily labor-led services.
Yeah, I think understanding that, what I think of as a total cost of ownership, or, at least a price deconstruction model is so important, or cost deconstruction. When we have so many clients coming to us saying that, the provider came back with X amount of increased request, and it's all over the map, right? So you really have to understand all the levers. When we look at those labor rates themselves, though, we really see this to be a long-term inflationary, outlook across a lot of different service areas. So David mentioned BPO, but a lot of the increases we're seeing are stronger on the IT side. It's really across the board, but if you look at some of these roles, major change looking in the next few months around IT infra roles, IT apps roles, some automation related roles within BPO, category sourcing roles, specifically customer contact center roles also increasing, and these are onshore, offshore, every city. So there's really a lot of variability, especially in skill sets across IT, where certain skill sets will be hot for a couple months and then the market will kind of catch up. If you reviewed your rate card or reviewed your pricing model a year ago or 18 months ago, it's most likely out of date at this point. Depending on where you were at that time, if you were in the 20th percentile, you're probably well below that now. If you were in the 80th percentile, you might be okay, but there's just a lot of noise and a lot of variability to get ahead of. So that is one thing that we've spent a lot of time with our clients on, is just trying to help them understand where they should be adjusting and where they shouldn't be adjusting to stay on top of the market and to be able to attract talent. Obviously, it's not just salary, but there's a lot of other, there's salary, wage rates, as well as some structural changes. David, tell us a little bit more about some of the structural changes you're seeing as well.
Yeah, thanks, Amy. I mean, I think it's a good point, really, which is that service providers will come and ask for rate increases, but also they should be coming, the best service providers out there are coming with these structural changes that they're also talking to you about. And I think it's about understanding and listening to those as well. So things such as sort of a bottom heavy team pyramid. So looking at rearranging the talent mix that you have, maybe to get those at the bottom of the pyramid, maybe the cheaper rates who can still provide a certain level of service. So thinking about how you structure that team that you have from the outsourced service provider. We're also seeing a move away from sort of the really heavy governance layers that we probably put in 5-10 years ago, and really think about how do we layer that, take that out, to take some of the cost out of that mix. I think the one that goes back to what Michael was saying earlier is around implementation of advanced automation solutions. So how do you take the need for people out of your service? And I think we're seeing a lot more focus in terms of that automation, either reduce the reliance on people or it's eliminate the contacts or the activities totally, or making the job quicker for people to do. So you actually can reduce the offset of the people cost there. And then also more offshoring. So thinking about other locations where maybe there is more talent available or it's at a lower cost. And what we're seeing as actually focusing in terms of different tier 2, tier 3 locations in the US, or even looking at places such as Costa Rica, Mexico, Colombia, if you're in the North American market, looking at sort of the LATAM market for those locations where you can get that little bit of a price break from where you were paying before. So I think really in summary, it's about, yes, there is going to be some increased cost that you're going to be asked for from your service providers, but it's also about looking at the other levers that you can pull, and whether that's the team pyramids or whether it's around automation, but looking at all the levers that you can pull to try and offset some of that.
So David, I want to jump in here. One of the little tricks I've been hearing about is, role inflation, title inflation. So, organizations said, well, I can't find anybody that wants to join as a junior salary, so I'll make it a senior. And so, I have a hypothesis that everybody's going to start out as a senior analyst or senior manager, and we won't have a pyramid at all, because we won't have any of the base level, because de facto is they need to get those salaries up so they can attract talent, and they're going to end up with a funky looking job description pyramid, if you will. And it's happening both on the insourcing and the outsourcing side.
Yeah, it's a good point. And I think the job of procurement there is to make sure you understand what skills are those roles bringing. And it's not really, the title shouldn't matter really. It should be about understanding, okay, what skills are we buying at these levels, and then trying to match the price appropriate to that. So yeah, you're right. I'm definitely seeing that as well. I think it's to say that's where procurement can really add value, by understanding, okay, well, what's that role actually delivering?
Yeah, David, I heard you got a new title. It was a senior analyst this year.
Yeah, I'm adding 3, and next year I'm going to go for 4 seniors added onto my title.
Yeah, there's a comment there that, messing around with the pyramid is counterproductive, as it starts to impact your retention and then stress of getting resources. And totally agree with that, giving fluffy or temporary changes to people, whether it's a title or whether it's just shifting your pyramid around, those are not long-term structural changes. They're not even long-term, midterm effective changes. They are likely going to get you in more trouble before this all ends, right? So
yeah, but Amy, I think it's a reality of the desperation that's out there that says, listen, I can't get my job titles changed and the pay structures change fast enough to reflect what's going on in the marketplace. So the only lever I can is to change the role that I'm hiring for when the title comes with it, but that's not the intent. It's just to get the salaries up there.
Yeah, yeah. Yeah, I think it's, the question is kind of how to address that. I mean, I think in an ideal situation, if you really understand the market and understand the roles that you need, you avoid those kind of, short-term knee-jerk changes, and you're addressing, broader root causes, and making the more structural changes you can along the way, like, looking at new markets and new talent populations. And we've had there's a whole list at the end of 6 other webinars on this topic too, that come up with a lot of different strategies in there that you can work with your stakeholders on. So there's a lot of bigger changes you can make that are going to give you more mileage 6 months from now, when your senior person wants a 4th senior on their job title. Or
Yeah. Well, I think that's the key. I think the key is to figure out which of these things really actually are reducing demand and are structural in nature versus those that are temporary and just playing the game.
Yeah. And I think when we look at this talent change, we don't look at it as a 6 month to 1 year challenge. We look at it as 3 to 5 year plus. And Michael's shown the demographics many times for why that's the case. But you really got to be thinking long term, how you're going to expand your framework and your operating model to accommodate this.
Yeah, no, Amy, you and I have looked at those charts many times, and I would remind people we're in the first inning of a 9-inning game for this talent shortage. It's coming, and it's going to get worse. It's not going to get better, unless we make some structural changes.
So just looking at some of the other specific challenges from sourcing that we heard when we talked to sourcing functions, procurement functions, one of the biggest was the high degree of manual and transactional work. This is obviously not new. It was number 4 before, and it's really jumped up. I think that the degree of manual work and the chasing PO kind of work that we have to do is amplified when we're struggling to find talent. So I can't say I'm surprised by this. I can say I wish we had solved this, in the last 12 to 15 years of my career when I've been talking to procurement organizations about technology. It's a pain point that's just amplified in this kind of environment. And of course, supply chain disruptions. Every time I get on a roundtable with CPOs or any kind of call or lunch and learn type situation, it's a conversation about what's the bigger headache right now. Is it supply chain, physical goods, or is it the cost increases around talent and the talent shortage, both in your categories and your team? I'd say in any product company, they're really struggling with the goods shortages and the challenges, and really interesting changes happening in the logistics sector if you talk to anyone who's deep into that. So we're not here to downplay that. We're just here to play to focus on the side of the coin that Everest Group focuses on, which is really the services piece. And that is driving, number 3, supply-based risks. It's driving, the lack of automation is driving talent availability and cost increases. All right. Sounds like doom and gloom. So what else are we facing?
No. We're gonna find the answers here. So on challenge number 3, it is really focusing on that supply based risk and supply chain disruption. And Amy, you live in California there. How many ships are offshore? Are they all?
I'm going to be honest. I flew over the port of Long Beach in October, and I took a picture because it was so startling to see the very straight lines of ships all the way off the port on your way into the Burbank or the Anaheim, Orange County Airport. You see pictures on TV, but you don't really believe that stuff until you're like, wow, that's a lot of ships. I can't see the end of the line, So, let's talk a little bit about what people are doing around the supply base and sort of the supply chain disruption. I think that the most interesting shift that I've seen, and I would say this happened in early, mid 2021, but is continuing, is that we've really gone from a buyer's market to not even a supplier's market, but a employees market. And because of that, we need to look at our services supply base quite differently. So, the last couple of years, people were shifting around the spend within their current providers. They were, maybe looking to consolidate and rationalize their portfolio. Almost every call we have now, we're not talking about, when we say rationalize, we mean, do we have the right providers for the work, but how do we also do things like adding in specialist providers, looking at new locations within our existing providers, making sure we have the right balance, something that we call, kind of a portfolio balancing, and something that we call control ratios. Setting those up to really make sure we're making good decisions around which providers we work with and how we allocate out our work to get the best results. So although these numbers, when I look at them, I kind of think, oh, this isn't a big shift. It looks like most people are sticking with their providers. I think the noise around shifting your supply base and looking at the risk in your supply base has amplified considerably in the last 8 months.
Yeah, and I think, Amy, it's a good point. And one of the things that I think that we're seeing is that, I've been in procurement a long time, and I've been on the buy side, and probably 5-7 years ago, it was all about consolidation and the massive push to say, reduce the amount of suppliers you get down to 2 or 3 strategic suppliers for particular categories. But exactly what you're saying, what we're seeing is that's actually reducing now. The redistribution, so balancing it across your existing suppliers, is really staying the same. But the real focus is coming on that additional suppliers to the portfolio mix who are bringing particular skill sets. So it might be services that you're having to outsource for the first time. It might be that some of your current service providers can't meet the demand. It might be that you're looking to go to a new geo and you're having to sort of look at a new supplier because your existing service providers aren't there. But definitely the trend that we're seeing is that around that portfolio diversification and moving away from consolidation. I do think, personal opinion, I think over the next couple of years, people will then take a look at that and then start to evaluate that again to say, how are we going to do it? And we touched in a minute a bit about supplier relationship management. And I think people will start to look at how they're managing their supplier base and how they're managing them effectively and how they're going to do that moving forward. But right now, there's definitely a push for more diversification.
Yeah, really interesting there. So, how do you look at this? I mentioned a couple things around portfolio strategy and the conversations we're having, and guiding some pretty big companies. And how do you put a process in place where your sourcing team works with key stakeholders to really think this through, which is kind of make versus buy, it's allocation of work. It's, you could call it, some people call it supplier stratification. I tend to think of it at the micro level of stratification. Who are our primary partners within this, sub category? And it really comes down to, starting with the top and building a governance model, establishing what your goals are going to be, and then managing to, put the visibility in place that you can monitor those goals, making sure everybody's on board. We're working across organizations to make sure that all of the stakeholders and procurement and vendor management are all kind of on the same page. And it's a bit, what is the senior, we talk about this, like your percent of outsourcing threshold is more religion than science, right? We think it should be 30%, or we think it should be 70%. Neither is wrong, but you've got to be kind of aligned to what that target is, so that you can execute to it. And then you've also got to drive your suppliers to expectations externally. So, running the business, managing against those KPIs, tight supplier performance management while you're trying to drive your suppliers to help you with innovation, get more productive, bring the best ideas to you to keep you competitive. So there's really no, silver bullet for all of this, but there's a lot of things that we've known for a long time are important, and doing them really well.
All right,
Michael,
so
let's go to challenge 4.
Yeah, let's talk about the other things to consider in this equation. So we talked about talent, we talked about supply chain, but let's talk about the other dimension here. Really focuses on the supplier performance, financial stability, and cybersecurity. Those are kind of bubbling to the top of the list here. I will have to say that over the course of the last 2 years, it's called the COVID era. We've been pleasantly surprised by how the service providers have stepped up in terms of delivering what's needed to get the job done. But that doesn't mean that everybody doesn't have a concern here or watching the marketplace very carefully. So David, talk to us about those concerns that have bubbled to the top of the list.
Yeah, thanks, Michael. And, yeah, and you're right in terms of, I think there is good news, and we cover it at the end of the webinar in terms of some positive feedback around service provider performance. So it's not all bad news, but any good procurement or sourcing team are still going to have some concerns that they want to be looking out for from their supply base. And when we asked this question about the most concerning aspects about their service providers, performance actually came right at the top. Followed by cybersecurity, and then financial stability, which actually has dropped quite a lot from 2021. And that may be as we've come out of the pandemic and people are less concerned about the impact. But I think when you look at things such as service provider performance, although we're getting feedback from buyers, which is their providers worked well throughout the pandemic and actually got the business up and running and continued it and managed it stably, I think now enterprise buyers are looking at, okay, how do we move to the next level? Our business now has got to move and progress. And can our service providers keep up with our aspirations for performance? So it's not saying performance is bad, but I think it's the concerning aspect is, can they keep up with us where we're going? I think cybersecurity is growing as well, because as we've got people working from home, I think what we saw during the pandemic is that people rushed to work from home and it worked really well. But actually people are now stabilizing, and if work from home is going to be part of an operating model of the future with more hybrid models, then how are you really going to then take cybersecurity to the next level? So I think that cybersecurity threats is why that's number two. And then financial stability of your service providers is really important, as we know, and as a procurement person, we would always be keeping an eye on that from a risk perspective. So that's what we're sort of hearing from procurement people and sourcing professionals, which is these are the biggest risks. And one of the ways that I've always seen work really well in terms of how you can keep a handle on these is really focusing on supplier relationship management and really having effective processes around managing your supply base. And I think, Amy, you're going to touch on some of the components of SRM.
Yeah, for sure. When we think about the components of SRM, it's a couple of the things that we've touched on, but really it's a holistic program across the organization, across categories, across different business units that may be working with providers. And that's really when I talk to sourcing or category managers about, what are you bringing to the table in your organization? You're bringing this enterprise-wide view across all spend, across all business units, and the external view of the supply base. That's fairly unique, as well as understanding your stakeholders' goals and what they're trying to achieve. SRM fits really well into that value prop of, supply-based governance. How are we going to interface with suppliers? What do we consider strategic? And what do we consider just sort of more routine supplier? Supply-based stratification, who is a strategic supplier, risk management. There are so many types of risk that we're dealing with right now, and we may touch on that a bit later, but definitely a lot of various, webinars we've done recently and papers where you can jump into details of supply-based risk management, but it should be kind of, collaborated at this level across an SRM program. David just talked a lot about performance management and where that fits in, as well as supplier innovation, which could be, when I think of supplier innovation on the product side, it tends to be like, hey, I want my suppliers to bring new ideas to help make my products more competitive, which we've seen that be differentiators for all kinds of leading companies. When you think about it on the services side, it's things like productivity and how do we get more value for our money, and things that, really require the right kind of business model with your suppliers to incent them for that, as well as tactics like innovation funds and more, effort on that note. Just going a little bit, deeper into some of the concerns about SRM, or some of the concerns about service providers, SRM is really about both the things on the left. So how are we maximizing our savings and optimizing our processes? And the things on the right, like how are we bringing in continuous process improvement and creative ideas? It's meant to bridge the gap. So if you're talking about, how do we maximize value from our supply base and move beyond just traditional savings, especially in a time when you're probably not going to see traditional savings because costs are going up. You really need to think about how are we managing our suppliers for the biggest possible, for the maximum types of value as well as amount of value. David, I touched on risk, and I feel like we need to dive into that a little more. So cybersecurity is one that we did a webinar a couple months ago on. Maybe you can just touch on that.
Yeah, sure, Amy. Yeah, and you're right. I mean, I think cybersecurity is one of those things which is, we saw it as a 50% or 50% of the audience were concerned about it. And I think that what we see is actually that cybersecurity and a lot of the risk elements, to be fair, so it's not just around cybersecurity, but what you tend to see is that before and during contracting, there's a real focus on getting the risk and the security elements nailed down, and there's a lot of focus on it. When you get into the running the contract, what you see is actually 2/3 of organizations actually do monitor their security postures of their providers. They're looking at that from a QBR perspective. There's potentially some external bodies that come in and do penetration testings, etc. There's a lot of focus, probably definitely at the start of the contract, and it drops a little bit in the middle. But one of the things that we probably call out as a really big concern is at the end of the relationship, only a quarter of organizations are focusing on this as something that they're looking at and they're monitoring. And I think it's really important as procurement and sourcing professionals that we actually take cybersecurity and all the risk elements seriously all the way through the life of the contract, and it's important at the end. And that's where a lot of the breaches can happen, when it's at the end and some of the eyes are taken off of the cybersecurity elements and things get left or things get forgotten. And I think it's also the same, and it's not specific to this slide, but I also think we see quite a lot of poor processes or poor rigor at the end of contracts around things like data security as well. And people forget that they're supposed to be getting sort of commercial sensitive data back, etc. So I think there's a lot of learnings that we can take as procurement and sourcing people in terms of the focus we put on these things at the beginning need to be continued all the way through the life of the contract, and probably even as important, if not even more important than at the start, at the end of the contract, to exit that contract professionally with all the right safeguards in place.
All right, fantastic. And it's a scary world out there if you're not protecting yourself, and you have to do do the right amount of due diligence all the way through the supply chain. So, all right, let's open up. What we're going to do is open up a quick poll here that if you're interested in getting more depth on our research from Amy and David, we have topics here that you can select from. And if you're an enterprise, we'd be happy to provide those to you. And if you want to follow up with Amy, David, or somebody on their team, we'll be happy to take you through there. But there's 2 questions that you can click on there. It says, hey, I'm interested more on the future of work. I'm more interested on the building a talent strategy for today and tomorrow, supplier management toolkit, portfolio strategies and outsourcing, and technology services. And if you just click the button there, that'll signal Amy and David to do a follow-up session with you as it applies. So we'll leave that open for another 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. All right, let's close that out. Okay, all right, moving on to the last challenge. We promised you 5. And one of the interesting topics that's always in play here, but it's getting more at play, if you will, going forward here, is really trying to understand the role of sourcing in ESG. So, Amy, ESG is not a single thing; it's a whole framework of concepts, and you're gonna do a chart here where we talk about how that definition has evolved and what it looks like today in many organizations or variations of that.
Yeah, so this has been, interesting. I've been working around this area with sourcing for, 15, 20, I could say longer, more years than that if I count some early roles. And, we've seen the role of procurement as well as what we consider and what we call things evolve quite a bit in that time. If you go back to, 10, 15 years ago, checkbook philanthropy, even earlier than that, maybe 20 plus years ago, payroll giving? How do we support the community? How do we write a check, right? Around the time in the early 2000s, and I remember this because it was, my business school time, triple bottom line was a really big deal. So we started looking at things like, beyond just the profit, we want to look at people, we want to look at the planet. And I remember, this being a pretty big focus back then, of starting to think about how do we expand the, financial reporting or shareholder, measurements and everything to take all these things into consideration. LEED certification was picking up, and you can see sort of the blue in this. There's nothing on these word webs, by the way, these word clouds that necessarily goes away. It's just that as we've evolved this topic, more things have come in. So around, the middle of the last decade, we started looking more at responsible business. I think most procurement organizations have had supplier diversity focuses for a while now. That was, both for compliance reasons, as well as many companies realize that having your supply base match your customer base and your employee base makes a lot of sense. So responsible business, more shared value, more investing into ESG. And then, more recently in the last several years, and this is really amplified by COVID, I think there's been a shift towards purpose-driven business and using the term ESG, environmental, social, and governance, and looking at stakeholder engagement, net zero, ethical consumption. And I think of purpose as tying in with the future of work as well. We all go to work every day for a reason, and that idea of punching the clock is a bit out of favor with employees for a lot of reasons. Not minimally because we spent a couple of years really thinking about what matters most, and so that's shifted. It's shifted how shareholders are approaching investment, and that is driving, or how investors are focusing. That's driving how shareholders look at some of these metrics, and it's driving how the procurement organization and the sourcing teams can, meet ESG goals and the investment that they have behind them, as well as the priority in the organization. We found that 77% of investors attached more importance to ESG because of the COVID outbreak and the pandemic that we've all been through. We've also seen that within the top 30 IT service providers that we've tracked, 51% of all sustainability investments from them were in the last couple of years. So that's a huge shift. I tend to think most of the big companies I've worked with had supplier diversity. They had sustainability teams. They were looking at this maybe in their packaging and their products and their materials, but seeing it in the IT service providers has really shifted the way that we can address these challenges and meet these goals. And I feel strongly that it's going to be buyer driven. So those service providers aren't doing this just because they think it's the right thing, or only because they think it's the right thing. They're doing it because the sourcing people on the phone today, on the call today, that are making these buying decisions or enabling their stakeholders are integrating those priorities into the purchasing decisions that they're making and their sourcing decisions. So it's a really interesting time. I think when we look at kind of the key ESG opportunity areas for sourcing teams to think about, there's a number of different things on the list there. One is, how do we go beyond supplier diversity? How do we target workforce diversity as well? I will say anecdotally, we're working on a RFI, proposal for a large tech company that has a very long list of recommended supports and recommended benefits for your employees. It's not mandated yet, but they're doing a great job of amplifying the values that they think are important in their workforce and making sure their suppliers understand those values. Think about impact sourcing. If you're not familiar with impact sourcing, when we talk about tapping new talent populations, new geographies, new pools of skills, please go back, and we've done a number of webinars and events on impact sourcing. And in fact, I think that IAOP has an impact sourcing day coming up next week where you can get a lot of really interesting information. They're a partner of ours.
Amy, let me jump in there for a second there. That impact sourcing was kind of a, more of a charitable type focus a few years back, but I think it's actually become a business imperative. Finding those, we had a huge talent shortage, and finding those hidden pools of talent. We hired a principal analyst just on this topic, and she's focused in on, like impact sourcing is one of the themes there. And, she and I have gone back and forth on that, and we kind of labeled that, how do you find hidden talent in your backyard, in your neighbor's backyard, and around the world? And I think it's going to be part of the overall theme here, is to be able to not only do it for the right reasons, but you're also going to do it out of a business necessity. And I think that's where these things come together, both on a, nice to do, but also a very pragmatic basis.
Well, it's pragmatic in the sense that, when we think about why is this talent hidden, right? There are structural barriers that make it harder for some people to get jobs, or make, that drove, a huge number of women out of the workforce over the last 2 years. How do we bring jobs back to those populations? Or that made a, small town, even onshore, have fewer job opportunities, right? How do we tap into those resources that may not be traditionally, reaching, we may not be reaching. And there are providers out there, service providers, that can help you with that. It's not that you have to go start a center in, a rural city with low infrastructure. There are plenty of providers that can help you understand how to access those workers who, frankly, have just the same level of capability and performance, if not better. Military spouses, small rural communities, prisoners, incarcerated individuals. There's just so many opportunities there to tap into workforces that might have been overlooked. I view it as, community impact, as well as another layer of diversity when we're bringing opportunities where they weren't in the past. There's also ESG related capabilities around, selection and ongoing management process. So, we talked about not paying attention to cybersecurity, and when you're managing your suppliers and exiting, people also tend to, ask a few questions up front on ESG, and then kind of, not monitor it as closely. And I think when we look at, ESG, there's also an opportunity for us as sourcing teams to really showcase the evidence points, not just environmental, but all aspects of it. What are we doing in terms of social governance? In ESG tends to mean like corporate governance, but we have a governance when we manage suppliers. We have a governance of, all of the processes that we lead. So how do you bring that G across the board in governing your supplier relationships, your sourcing engagements, to really mirror not just the regulations, but to mirror the intent of your corporate ESG initiatives. And with that, I'll let David talk a bit more about some of the enablers here.
Yeah, thanks, Amy. Yeah, I mean, I think you've covered it all pretty well, really. I mean, I think as we start to think about the areas that we should be thinking about, and I think procurement and sourcing have always struggled to work out, okay, how do we play in this? If the whole organization are talking about ESG, how do we play in this? And I think the examples on this slide and what you've just talked about are where actually that sourcing and procurement can really have a part to play. So I was going to call out risk management and supplier governance, talk about impact sourcing. It's an area that I've been close to in the past as well. But there are a lot of areas that we can be making sure that we have an impact. But I think really on the next slide, we talk a bit more about the sort of the drivers and the objectives that we can be using. So what we can see here is that you can actually start to really nail down an organization's objectives to make sure you've got the right ESG strategy for your supplier base. So if you want to address the demographic challenges, then you can look to increase spend with local suppliers. If you really want to sort of maintain service levels but address that talent attrition, then you can look for suppliers that are using impact sourcing as an example. And this isn't an exhaustive list, but it's really examples of how you can actually take an organizational goal, and then sourcing and procurement can have a part to play in that. If you're looking at encouraging diverse and inclusive culture, then that's where you start looking at your spend with your diverse suppliers. And then if you're looking to achieve net zero goals in 5 to 10 years, then you can start thinking about the services providers that you have they committed to a net zero target as well? And what are they doing about it? And actually, how are you going to track it in a consistent way? So I think that procurement can really take a lot of kudos from starting to think about, okay, how do we play a role in ESG? Because organizations are talking about it all the way down from the board, and we don't want procurement feeling that they don't have a part to play. And I think that by following this approach and looking at some of the areas that we can drive through our supply base, and then making some of our supplier targets related to ESG, I think that we can play a really strong part in that.
Yeah, that definitely. You can tell there's a lot of opportunity here. I want to kind of start to wrap things up, not on a completely negative note, because as I said, this sounds a little doom and gloom earlier. I think there's a lot of good news in our key issues study this year. When we look at the sourcing teams or enterprise in general satisfaction with service providers, it's actually pretty high. It's gone up. Increasingly satisfied around things like, communication, impact to performance levels, or performance levels, I should say, decision-making, partnership mindset. What's interesting is that when we went into the COVID pandemic in 2020, there was so much uncertainty with how these service providers would survive, right? Going from in the office where you're dealing with desktop computers that are locked to a desk to working from home, and then all of the security around that, all of the, the potential downtime, as well as, expected workforce absenteeism. We talked about that a lot in 2020. We didn't really see that until Delta hit and then Omicron, where, hey, here in the US at my local, store has workforce absenteeism issues right now. So we've really been through a long time where I think we could have seen this industry really falter, and we've seen the opposite. We've seen service providers step up, communicate. We've seen a bit more partnering to get through a crisis, and the margins have stayed high, which as a sourcing person drives me nuts, but also is good for the supplier, for the longevity and the minimization of risk with these big providers. So I think in general, we've seen positive emergence from the crisis among the service providers, and sourcing really has done a good job of managing that.
Yeah,
so,
and I think.
Yeah, go ahead, Michael.
Yeah, no, I think it's been an interesting 2 years here, and I think that the industry I'm very proud of. I've been part of it for 3+ decades, and I'm very proud of how we performed. I do worry about the next, crisis down the road, which is the shortage of talent, and it's not going to be something that that insourcing or outsourcing is going to solve with a magic wand. It's going to be something that's going to be very structural. You talked about the ESG. I go back to that and still say that those hidden talent pools are going to be an absolute requirement, and the folks that are best positioned to go invest in those and make that happen on a broad basis are these service providers. So I hope they're listening. I hope they're thinking about how they're going to find the people, because you just can't depend on where we used to get it. You can't put a help wanted sign and expect people to show up at your door. It's just not the way it's going to work down the road. So, and the demographics are such a way that this is, again, like I said, we're in the first inning of a multi-year or multi-decade challenge. So Amy, David, this has been good. Amy, why don't you, I always try to avoid the commercials here, but we did want to put in one conversation here, a quick 60 seconds on how you help your clients, Amy.
Yeah, so again, not commercials so much as education, because I think a lot of people jump on these webinars because they like the topic, but they don't really understand who Everest Group is still, at least not within the sourcing community. So we cover complex service categories, things like IT services, business process services or BPO, operational services that are specific to industries like financial services, banking, insurance, healthcare, life sciences, as well as other areas like contingent workforce and service delivery automation and any kind of locations information. And across all of that, do a lot of pricing assurance and SLA, and what I kind of think of as the commercial side validating your contracts, your pricing, your terms, all of that. So we have a couple different programs membership wise, and we also do projects. We help with market intelligence to sourcing teams. If you have a lot of spend in IT services going to third parties or across outsourced categories going to third parties, understanding that market is incredibly important. It's very complex. There's a lot changing in it. We've seen huge shifts. And then we also help with the commercial side, as I mentioned. So understanding, not just the right pricing rates, although that's important, but what are the, what's the right pyramid, right? What's the right skills, which skills are ahead, which are behind, what kind of terms do we have around cost of living in our contracts, for instance. There's a lot of analytics that we can offer in that area. So, we work, our focus is global services. We go very deep in that, and just want to kind of give people that background. So when we speak from this, when we speak on these topics, we're talking from about 250 to 300 analysts now focused on these categories.
All right, thank you, Amy. We got time for just one or two questions, and I'm looking through the questions that came in during the session and questions we got pre-session. So we're not going to be able to get through any. We're going to only touch a small fraction of those, and we'll try to follow up with those that ask questions offline. But given inflationary pressures, how are teams responding to continued focus on achieving savings? And so, this industry has always been based on cost takeout. And it's been a net cost reduction year over year. So sometimes you had to have blended rates were put in place by using more offshoring levers and that more automation. Those are driving down the cost. Didn't say salaries were always going down, but today it's universally up, and that's a pivot in the industry. How are customers reacting to that, to those approaches by the vendors and service providers? And how does that mesh with the procurement mantra of saving money? Amy, I'll get you a first shot at that.
Thanks. Yeah, so there's a lot going on in that question. I mean, I think that there's several steps in terms of responding, and I saw a couple different questions on this in terms of what is procurement saying, what is leadership saying around addressing some of the cost increases. I mean, I think that there's actually, we hit on a number of things. One is understanding, the level of cost increase, the magnitude of cost increase versus wage increases, right? So really getting to the bottom of it. We're seeing some friction right now between the CIO's office and the CPO or CFO's office that, this question kind of brings me back to where CIOs are saying, look, I have digital imperatives. I need to increase my cost structure. CPOs are still saying, look, we have savings goals. And that's what the CFO holds us to. And there's a lot of internal resolution of that, as well as the negotiation with service providers to get to, what is the right level. So, or what is the right price? What's a reasonable amount of cost increase? I think I hit that. I can't see all of the questions, Michael. So you had multiple layers in that one, but
yeah. So I think that you hit it right on the head there. I think that the reality is that this is a changed market, and cost savings in terms of rate reductions is not going to happen across the board. Like I said, if you have more of an infrastructure technology play, you can expect it there. But if it's a labor pay, prices are going to be going up, and you can't do anything about that now. The one suggestion that I would have is if we're seeing all these out of cycle rate increase requests, and if you ignore them and you have a labor-based contract, what you're going to find is you're getting the bottom of the barrel for new recruits. So if you're underpaying in the marketplace, that's going to hurt you in the long term. But
I agree. And I'd say that one of the main pieces of advice we're giving around bonuses, rate increases, whatever, is don't do anything too permanent, too long term. It's almost like they tell you, in the first year after a trauma, to not make any major decisions, right? Don't lock in long-term low rates. Don't abandon all your suppliers and shake up the whole plan. Do things that are going to help you in the near term. Think about structural changes, but keep things flexible as well.
Well, and I think you can be very simple. If you want a 10% rate increase, bring me a 10% productivity improvement.
Exactly.
I mean, that, or, you know, hey, if they want to be bold, they want a 20% rate increase, ask for a 20% improvement in productivity. So I think there's some trade-offs, and you can force some of those issues and maybe net not see the total impact be too bad. So, all right, we're out of time. Amy, David, I want to thank you for your participation. This was a series of webinars that we're doing around the 5 success driving actions. So we had the original key issue webinar back in December, and what we're doing is following that up here. So today was on sourcing and vendor management, and we're going to talk about talent in the one coming up here shortly. So thank you for your time. If there's any questions that you can want to reach out to David or myself or Amy, please do so. You can find us on our emails or on our LinkedIn. Again, thank you for your time.
Thank you.
Thanks,
Thanks, Michael.
Thank you.